Welcome to another COVID-19 law and policy briefing produced by Public Health Law Watch, a George Consortium initiative housed at Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University, the Network for Public Health Law, and ChangeLab Solutions. We are here to provide expert legal analysis during the COVID-19 pandemic and hopefully to answer some of your questions. For more information on the legal response to COVID-19, please check out our report, the COVID-19 Policy Playbook, at www.covid19policyplaybook.org. I'm George Contreras, a professor of law at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. Joining me today are Professor Brook Baker at Northeastern University School of Law and Ana Santos Rutschman, assistant professor of law at St. Louis University School of Law and director of the Law and Policy Core at the SLU Institute for Vaccine Science and Policy. So today's topic could not be more timely or important: vaccine access around the world during COVID-19. Half a dozen vaccines have been approved and are in production around the world for COVID-19, but the supply of those vaccines has proven not to be sufficient for everyone in the world and possibly won't be for years. What do we do about that? Is there anything to be done? And what are some practical next steps that we might take in the United States or elsewhere to deal with this problem? Professors Baker and Rutschman will be talking about these issues for the next 20 minutes. So first question I have, I'll address to Professor Rutschman first. And right now, what is the biggest obstacle to increasing the manufacture and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines around the world?
Well, it is a great question because I think it speaks to two things that we've known for a long time we were not particularly good at, and we failed to do. So the first thing I would say is that we're talking about a technological problem. We do have vaccines that have been authorized based on different types of vaccine technology, including a newish type of vaccine technology, but we lack in many ways the capacity to produce the vaccines at the scale we would need to. And this is a lack of pandemic preparedness that I don't think it's technology specific, but we've seen this coming. We've been warned about this, and it's obviously difficult to bounce back from this. There are mechanisms that I think we're discussing that are being either tried or in place to help facilitate increases in production, but we do have a technological problem in that we can't just ramp up production of vaccines to the point we would need to be doing at this point in the context of a pandemic. And the second thing I would say is more on the legal side of things. I would frame it on the negotiable, at the negotiable level. There are many things that can be done prior to the onset of a pandemic or earlier than the point we're at that have not been done. So a lot of tech transfer, for instance, and transfer of knowledge that we need to ramp up production has not been negotiated. So we're dependent on voluntary actions, and this is not exactly, the ideal time to be negotiating that. So having had some things in place beforehand for these transfers to happen in a speedier fashion would have been helpful. And I think these are the two main failures at this point.
Fantastic. Well, we'll come back around to the legal questions in just a second, but let me just ask you a clarifying question on the technology. So you briefly alluded to what we know as the mRNA vaccine technology, which is a new technology, but not all of the COVID vaccines are mRNA vaccines. Are we having more technological problems with this particular mRNA technology, or is this a problem that cuts across the board with all the vaccine technologies that are out there?
My reading of the situation, and whenever you have a biological at stake, this is bound to happen. So in previous public health crises, and some of them affecting the global south in the ways that the access to vaccines presently is doing, dependent on a different type of pharmaceutical technology, and we could much more easily replicate conventional drugs. I'm thinking the HIV/AIDS crisis, a few decades ago, which continues to today, but there was a much more clear technological path to replicate those products. That's not just the case with vaccines. I think that although the technology of each one of these vaccines is slightly different, just the idea that we can do what we've done before, we're struggling with that right now. It's very hard to replicate a vaccine without some degree of infrastructure that we've not planned for, and without some degree of collaboration from the manufacturers and patent holders. So with biologics in general, that's just very hard from a technological perspective.
Great, thank you. Professor Baker, what do you view as the biggest obstacle, or unless you agree completely with Professor Rutschman?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Anna has said, and I do think that the issue of who owns the technology, how open it is in terms of the knowledge and technical expertise that is represented in the different vaccine platforms is critically important. Of course, there are other, you asked for the single most, and there are multiple things that have to happen. I mean, everything from, technology transfer and increased manufacturing capacity and repurposed manufacturing capacity, health systems, procurement and distribution, adequate funding. I mean, none of it is sufficient in its own, but some things are quite necessary. The piece of the puzzle that I focus much more on, which I think is a major barrier, are intellectual property rights that the vaccine originators now have used to enclose the technology expertise and special know-how that Anna has referred to. The system of patent protections, more important in the vaccine context, confidential information and trade secret information, including for the biological materials themselves. In some cases, for other technologies, even copyright and industrial designs. And basically, we have allowed, even though there's been considerable public financing of vaccine development and clinical trials and expansion of manufacturing capacity through public support, actually in the neighborhood of $100 billion globally, and well over $20 billion in the US alone. Despite all that investment, we have let the companies hold those exclusive rights, which have allowed them to, in my opinion, artificially restrict capacity, supply, to charge prices much higher than the cost of manufacture, and then to, through their right to control distribution, to preferentially provide vaccine access to rich countries that can afford to pay more, and that help to subsidize their initial efforts. And so we have, as a result of this system of prioritizing intellectual property protections, we have what is now called vaccine apartheid. I think where Anna and I have disagreed a bit in the past is, will overcoming intellectual property barriers in a formal sense get you the full bucket of technology that's needed and technical expertise that's needed for other companies to quickly come on board in terms of being able to produce good quality product that is safe to use, globally. And I think we have some slight difference of opinion about that particular issue. But I would say that when you've enclosed that kind of technical knowledge within a set of exclusivities, that's a barrier that needs to be overcome. There still may be additional things that have to happen to incentivize technology transfer, to aid in the absorption of that expertise by people who don't have it already and companies that don't have it already. But it would be so much easier to address that narrow problem of what is sometimes called tacit knowledge or some very specialized technical expertise. It'd be a lot easier to deal with that smaller part of the puzzle if we took away all the surrounding intellectual property exclusivities that don't even allow us to get to that more central problem.
So turning back to Professor Rutschman, so both of you have mentioned a number of obstacles that face us today, but obviously these challenges are well known to many people around the world in government and science, and somebody is taking steps to try to address them, maybe successfully, maybe not, both at the national level, at the international level, the United Nations, and so forth. So how successful are current efforts to overcome these technological obstacles? Is any progress being made with any of these?
I think there's certainly, incremental progress being made. And again, in the context of a pandemic and recognizing that there's long been failures in pandemic and epidemic preparedness, even incremental steps, I think, are good news, even though they're largely, I think, insufficient. There is something that's not strictly, I would say, related to intellectual property, although I think intersects with IP's exclusionary regime, which is more at the allocation level of vaccines. We have taken some important steps in that area by at least creating a structure that, albeit limited, has the ability to introduce some fairness to this allocation process. And I'm talking about COVAX, which is an international public-private partnership, which I've been critical of in the past, the way it has been structured, dividing outcomes between countries that self-fund their participation versus countries that do not. But I think they provide, some at the remedial level, they provide a useful framework by getting us out of the vaccine, to use Brook's expression, apartheid situation, the global south versus the global north. Now, this is not enough, right? We keep hearing about severe imbalances in the way we allocate vaccines, vaccine hoarding by countries in the global north, and the like. So I think we actually have the legal tools to some extent to at least continue ameliorating that problem, to at least nudge some countries to donate, right? This is something they can commit to doing, and they don't exactly do it, right? They either sit on supplies or at some point decide to do it, but they don't commit to some trigger that would actually make them donate surplus vaccine doses. So I see some progress there. I'm not entirely happy with the landscape. If you're asking me about ramping up production of vaccine technology, on the other hand, I think progress has been much slower. I don't necessarily think that doing anything with intellectual property at this point is going to help us much. We're far too deep into it, and reliant on voluntary collaborations, which are not happening to the extent we'd love to see them. But we also have an infrastructure problem. My understanding from talking to a lot of people involved in the transfer tech that's actually happening for these vaccines is that some promising sites turn out not to be, as fully equipped as we would have hoped that. So in this context, I do think that things that might have worked in other outbreaks, compulsory licensing, for instance, or the version, not compulsory licensing, but sort of the blanket approach that the proposed waiver would take, those are things that I think it's too late, basically, for those things to be considered. And we have the infrastructural problem that we have not quite sorted out.
Okay, Professor Baker, what do you think? Is it too late to pursue these intellectual property measures?
Well, I don't think it is, because as I hoped to describe earlier, IP has been the major constraining factor, or a significant constraining factor, and has led us to the predicament we're in. So if not now, when would we start to dismantle some of those barriers to produce capacity that will help us at the later stages of this pandemic, because it's not going to end end of 2021 or even end of 2022, but also to be prepared globally with sustainable, adequate, distributed, democratically controlled production capacity in other regions of the world besides the global north, and some contract manufacturers in the global south as well. So the reason I'm not quite as optimistic, I think Anna feels we're so path dependent on the system we have that we're not quite sure we can, that we can do anything to get us out of this mess. So we have to essentially ask for more of the same from industry. They have entered into a lot of bilateral agreements. They say they have over 280 contract manufacturing and supply agreements, 200 of which have supported some technology transfer. And we know that they've basically gone from ground zero in terms of being able to produce either mRNA vaccines or the viral vector vaccines to being able to produce hundreds of millions of doses. Now, we estimate probably at this point in time something close to 2 billion doses globally. And they've done that in a matter of months. And so my question is, well, if they were able to do it in a matter of months with significant investments and also with public supports, why couldn't someone else if the technology was made available? So there are several things to try to force them to do that. There was initially at the very beginning an effort to create a voluntary technology access pool, the COVID-19 pool. There's also the COVID pledge that you and others worked on to try to get intellectual property rights from companies. But by and large, especially the biopharmaceutical industry and even the diagnostic industry has not joined those technology access pool initiative. They have not engaged in the kind of large scale, voluntary, not tightly commercially controlled agreements that we would like. And that's what prompted South Africa, India, and now the other 61 countries that support them to offer a proposal at the World Trade Organization to waive intellectual property protections on COVID-related medical technologies for a period of time. And the latest text is for a minimum of 3 years. And again, that's because of the absence of sufficient voluntary action by industry, the Global South has said, we are dying. We are standing in line and waiting to die because of the inadequate supply and grossly inequitable distribution of these products. Untie our hands. Not only untie our hands by getting rid of the intellectual property barriers, but help us in building the capacity we need to make the supplies that are needed. And so, I think that the idea that we've been able to, that the companies would come to the kind of response that is needed through voluntary measures and through their own actions, they haven't thus far. And the situation is dire. And why would we expect that more of the same would produce a much better outcome? So I agree with, if Anna is saying waiving tomorrow will not put more vaccines in people's arms next week, I agree with her. But I do think that we can set in motion a build out of capacity that could take place in a matter of months, not years. And Anna and I, again, have had, we hear different things about how much capacity there is. But we also have to remember that, Moderna had never made a vaccine in its life. It didn't have any commercial manufacturing capacity, and it's going to end up making 800 million doses this year. Pfizer had never made this kind of product previously, and they're going to be making, hundreds of millions and even a couple billion doses. So, I think it is possible to scale things up. I think there is underutilized capacity, and there has to be a stick in someone's hand to make companies come to the table differently and engage in technology transfer. The best outcome that I would see is somewhat between what the two of us have already talked about. I think with a threat of a waiver, the companies would come to the table in a different way. And they would voluntarily agree to transfer technology in a more open way and a quicker way. And governments could support the investment and repurposing of capacity that's needed. So that would be my hope, that the waiver and the threat of the waiver and of involuntary action would actually cause a change in industry behavior that just leaving the status quo does not accomplish.
Great, thank you. Professor Rutschman, 1 minute or less, any final thoughts? What one thing would you want to see happen to help us address this situation in the short term?
So I would like to focus attention on equitable distribution of existing doses. Again, the differences between vaccine technology as biologics and other types of drugs for which the nudges that we've been discussing, even the threat of tinkering with intellectual property rights might prompt industry to do something I don't see them working here, right? When Brazil said we will replicate this drug, we all believed Brazil, right? The companies are very, very sure that that might not be the case. So I would recommend focusing even more attention than we have on the allocation of existing doses, while continuing to work in sort of backstage work. We absolutely need a fairer system. We need a much less market dependent system, and we need to get out of this situation that, based on the characteristics of a technology, we might have replicability problems. So I would want countries not to sit on their supplies. I would love to see more international solidarity at this point, and I do think there's the capacity, production-wise, to start channeling vaccine doses to the arms who, at this point, the people who really need them the most. So that's where I would be focusing on.
Great. Brooke, final word?
Okay, so since we're in the US, I'm going to talk about the US, okay? And I'm going to talk specifically about the person with the most power to do something, which is President Biden. So the US has surprisingly come out in support of a waiver on the vaccine, on intellectual property on the vaccine. I think that needs to be expanded to all products, but I think President Biden needs to use the bully puppet a bit more to get other countries that are resistant, those in Europe, Japan, Switzerland, Norway at this point, to also come to the table to engage in text-based negotiations. But the U.S. also has the power of the purse, and they have some patent rights to some of the mRNA vaccines. They have the Defense Production Act. They can actually get going on putting much more pressure on industry to begin to transfer technology. Some of that could be, for internal domestic production, but we do have to invest now in globalized production capacity so that other countries aren't always left behind. So my call would be to put pressure, and including people who are listening to this particular message, who have public policy chops and may have access to centers of power into this administration, to put some pressure on to actually make the technology transfer happen. I'm completely with sharing more equitably the doses that are available now and making different arrangements, but we also need more capacity, and that won't happen unless someone starts pressuring to make it happen and starts funding and incentivizing the transfer that's necessary.
Great, fantastic. Well, lots of critical things that need to happen and lots of challenges in front of us. But thank you, Ana Santos Rutschman and Brook Baker, for being with us today. And thank you to everyone who's listening. Recordings of today's session are available on the Public Health Law Watch website. And the shows are archived by the Week in Health Law podcast at www.twihl.com. The COVID-19 law and policy briefings are produced by Faith Kalik and Bethany Saxon. We'll see you next time. Everyone, please stay safe.